weaponized trade, what is the best EU anti-coercion strategy to defend the single market? And now I'm absolutely aware that the talk of the town in Brussels and elsewhere is Russia gearing up for war against Europe and its values. But today we're talking trade, or are we? Because here's my initial thesis. More details to follow later. The framework in which almost all EU foreign policy debates are taking place is the global conflict between authoritarianism and democracy. And this is not just great power politics. This is freedom versus tyranny, in our view. And democracy is under attack, and we have to defend it. And we have to do it smartly and realistically. So here's what happened. First of all, already a couple of months and years back, in the framework of the strategic autonomy debate, the EU has been thinking for some time of an instrument to defend itself and its single market against coercion from other powers. Because the world has gotten rougher and international institutions weaker. So we need to learn the language of power, to quote Josep Borrell and a couple of other representatives of the EU institutions. The French Council presidency has prepared to make this a priority issue already some time ago. And then, beginning in November 2021, came China's unprecedented political and economic campaign against Lithuania, because Lithuania had decided to deepen its relations with Taiwan. All this has enormous potential consequences for the single market and for political and economic cohesion in the European Union. So next to the challenge of war in the East, the immediate challenge these days, this may well be the biggest external challenge the Union will face in the near future. And a pan-European debate on how the EU should react to this crisis is in full swing with an anti-coercion instrument, and also from last week onwards, a case brought to the World Trade Organization. This is the central focus of what we are discussing today. So let me briefly introduce our speakers here. We have Mantas Adomėnas, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Lithuania, joining us from Vilnius. And we have Reinhard Bütikofer. Welcome, Reinhard. Good that you joined us from Berlin, who is member of the European Parliament for the Greens and EFA, usually in Brussels and Strasbourg. We have Iana Dreyer, founder and editor of Borderlex, which is an internet-based resource on trade, global trade, and EU trade questions, joining us from Paris this morning. And last but by no means least, Gunnar Wiegand, the Managing Director, Asia and Pacific in the European External Action Service in Brussels. And let me just make, before we get started with content, let me make a couple of housekeeping points. First of all, this debate is entirely public. I mean, we have people joining us in the sense of listening to the debate from across the globe. And there is a Q&A. You will have the possibility to ask questions or even make short comments. And the way this works is via Slido, the app Slido. And Rastio, I'm asking you, yes, to come in with the Slido slide. There are two ways for you to access this and ask questions or make comments. And one is you go to the Slido app, slido.com, and you put in hashtag GLOBSEC in capitals. The other possibility is actually to scan the QR code that is still visible now. Scan the QR code and you get access to this directly. You know, in order to keep this short and snappy, we agreed to have one initial round of contributions from our speakers for the kickoff. Then we'll have a back and forth between the speakers, and then there will be a session for questions and answers from our hopefully numerous audience. So thank you again for joining. I would now like to start the round of kickoffs with Mantas Adomėnas, Deputy Foreign Minister of Lithuania. Mantas, tell us more about the coercion that Lithuania and its companies, as well as other companies, other countries' companies experienced. What were the political aspects? What were aspects in social media? And why is this an attack on the entire single market of the European Union? Floor is yours.
Thank you, Roland. As you rightly noted in your introduction, it's rather difficult to abstract from the events which are about to unfold in just sort of 1,000 kilometers away from us in Ukraine, just across Belarus. But as Kai Lung said, however entrancing it is to wander unchecked in the gardens of bright images, are we not distracting our mind from a matter of almost equal importance? And that matter of almost equal importance is, I think, a much longer term and having much longer term implications matter of using economic coercion for the first time on the scale which that threatens the whole of EU market. My role, I think, here is very sort of simple, and initially to set out the sort of the case, the case story of what happened and why are we where we are. You mentioned that unprecedented level of Chinese coercion started in November of the last year, but in fact, the first sort of economic restrictions were even sort of preceded the confirmation of the present government, which came in the late autumn of 2020, just because it mentioned the need in its manifesto, the need to expand economic, cultural, and social relations with Taiwan. And even before that government was sworn in, some sanctions were already applied to Lithuanian food and agricultural products being exported to China. Then what followed was the well-known story that Lithuania left the 17+1 format in the February of last year. There were restrictions on the development of 5G network, also rulings about the investments, proposed Chinese investment into the strategic port of Klaipėda, and each step was followed by certain corresponding moves. But of course, the culmination was the agreement to open Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius in the summer of last year, and its opening in November, which was followed primarily, first of all, by downgrading of level of diplomatic relations between Lithuania and China, recall of ambassadors, and then unilateral downgrading of embassy level contacts into chargé d'affaires office, not representative office, but China unilaterally renamed its representation chargé d'affaires office in Lithuania and demanded Lithuania also to follow the same suit. This being sort of in the contravention of Vienna Convention as well as Lithuanian laws on the matter. So despite Lithuania's objections, China invalidated the IDs of Lithuanian embassy in Beijing. So all the staff found themselves basically visa-less and almost illegal in the territory of China and had to be evacuated very quickly before any arrest took place. But of course, the matter that attracts most attention is the economic sanctions, which started as bilateral ones. And this was something that was modeled. By us when we are considering Taiwan's request to open the Taiwanese representative office. Even though we emphasized at every stage in our communications and kept our Chinese colleagues informed of Lithuania's decisions, that it's not going to be a diplomatic representation, that it's not going to be any formal representation. It's identical in its function and status to all this sort of representative offices across Europe. Nevertheless, we foresaw that the name Taiwanese was going to provoke a sort of a reaction, but that was important to emphasize that what determines the content of Lithuania's One China policy is Lithuania's sovereign decision and not Chinese red lines, which were pushed very far ahead. So initially we sort of faced bilateral sanctions such as erasing, well, some unorthodox ones, such as erasing Lithuania from the customs database in China. So when people try to declare the goods for exports to China, they couldn't find the country on the drop list, sort of drop down list of countries that imports could come from. And of course, it was applied to initially rather sort of sporadically, but also sort of bans on exports of materials, especially strategic materials, especially sort of raw materials for sort of products for high-tech industries in Lithuania, and sort of increasingly expanding sort of ban on all Lithuanian exports to China in all sort of in a number of areas. What really was a new step, and that's what we couldn't foresee by analyzing the previous practice of sanctions against Australia or Canada or Sweden in the previous in the previous instances of such sanctions being applied, was application of as well secondary sanctions, whereby not only sort of Lithuanian exports would be banned, but any products either coming from German multinational companies, French or US multinational companies, which had in them Lithuanian components. So basically, this was a sort of secondary sanctions, and they attacked not only sort of Lithuania as the exporter, but actually the whole of the EU. That's why it makes sense to speak that the single market of the EU as a trading bloc has been sort of sanctioned by China in order to exercise pressure on Lithuania to step down politically. Now, of course, while the merits of the bilateral case can be debated, but what is here the sort of the unprecedented move is using economic coercion against the whole of the EU market and even broader, and it is in the interest of all the market economies in democratic worlds at large to stop and sort of deter such coercive practices, because if this case succeeds, then China acquires a sort of a way to weaponize global supply chain as a means of political pressure. And that's why sort of we welcome EU's case with and first in principle stance and action launching the WTO case against China's coercive measures on Lithuania, and as well as with countries such as United States and UK for their solidarity, and in Australia supporting Lithuania's case in the World Trade Organization. So this is sort of briefly, and I already overstepped sort of my time. This is the setting out of the case, which I think is a matter for debate, sort of coming from the horse's mouth, as it were. I was at the center of these events and had a tiny role in bringing them about. But I will be glad to come in later with observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mantas. Great kickoff presentation, and really, you did stay within the time limit, so that was quite nice. And I would like now to move to Reinhard Bütikofer and ask you, to what extent is there sufficient solidarity within the European Union with Lithuania and sufficient defense of the single market? I remember you were a signatory to a letter of 40 members of the European Parliament some days ago that called upon solidarity from other member states and from the EU institutions. Do you think that the letter's demands are being heard and fulfilled? Over to you, Reinhard.
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me and for organizing this great event. I have already initiated the first letter in support of Lithuania in August last year, and that was co-signed by over 60 MEPs from, I think, 5 or 6 different political groups. And there has been a substantial amount of support and solidarity, in particular from the European Parliament. Just this last month, in a resolution that we passed with 585 votes in favor and only 41 votes opposed, we again expressed our solidarity and our support for Lithuania. But the European Parliament doesn't stand alone. Last year, first President von der Leyen and President Michel signed a very clear letter. Then Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, together with HRVP Borrell, also made a public statement. So there has been substantial support, and I would still say it's not enough. It's not enough exactly because it hasn't completely sunk in. That's what I would say, that this is not anymore an issue that concerns just Lithuania. It has become a Europeanized issue. China has turned the screw in a way that forces the EU to stand up and defend the holy grail of European integration, which is the single market. We have seen the decision to take the case to the WTO, which I think is something we had to do, but it will take a while. I would predict that the work on the anti-coercion instrument that has been started by Commission will be probably going faster than originally foreseen, because we clearly can recognize the need for such an instrument, and still that's not enough. I think there has to be also a dimension of political and economic support. Political support, I mean, in particular from individual member states. Give you an example. When our new chancellor, Olaf Scholz, first had a phone call with Xi Jinping, he did not mention Lithuania, which he should have. When he had another phone call with Li Keqiang, the Chinese prime minister, he did mention Lithuania, which was the right thing to do. And also several ministries from Germany clearly signaled that there is also national support from Berlin. The state secretary from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate went to Vilnius. I think our foreign minister had a separate meeting with a Lithuanian foreign minister at the Gymnich. And I also think that President Macron has made a couple of very important statements. It has to become a talking point at every discussion with the Chinese, to tell them this is not just something that is being dealt bureaucratically at some offices in Brussels. This is a common concern. And the other measures that we have to take is economic, because there are obviously impacts. There's loss of trade, but there's also a risk to investment in Lithuania. And I've seen measures both from the Taiwanese and from the US that have announced additional investment. I've also seen information that both the German government and the US government have had some of the European investors in Lithuania on the phone telling them, we don't want you to succumb to China's pressure to withdraw from Lithuania. And I think more of that should be coming. By the way, I just want to make this one point. I don't think the conflict is about the name of the office. There has been one office called Taiwan office before, and that's the office in Beijing, which deals with Taiwan. And I believe that calling it a Taiwanese office is well within the limits of the EU's One China policy. So Lithuania has not crossed any red lines. And I don't think it's because of the name, it's because of the fact that China, just like Russia, wants to impose their views on smaller nations. They are partners in crime, in the crime of big power infringement on other nations' sovereignty, and that's at stake here.
Thanks very much for this passionate appeal. I would have a couple of follow-up questions, but let's wait for the second round. And for the moment, continue with Gunnar Wiegand. And I would like to ask you, Gunnar, I mean, listening to this from the European Parliament and from Lithuania, what is your response? Has the EU's response to weaponized trade been sufficient so far? And what else would you have up your sleeve? And I know very well that you work in the External Action Service, and there are other EU institutions such as the Commission in place. But for the sake of debate, you know, we don't have that many slots here. So you are kind of the representative of those EU institutions here in this debate. Gunnar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roland, for providing me with this opportunity. I will try to the best of my abilities to also represent colleagues from the Commission in their work on this. And I learned one thing when I was a spokesman some decades ago: never talk about everything which is up in your sleeves in public. We will not disclose everything which the EU can do, but I'm happy to talk about things we are already doing and which will have an impact and which show the full solidarity of the 26 other member states and of the EU institutions with Lithuania. This is about the use of trade as a weapon. It is about the combination of the use of economic means for political and security purposes. And I want to be clear from the beginning: economic security and resilience is a question which does not only relate to China discussions, but also to discussions concerning other partners who are not shy in using economic weapons. And I think you referred to one at the very beginning of your introduction, as well as Vice Minister Adomėnas did. So while tools and solutions may differ, it remains that we are more and more confronted, indeed, as democracies, as market economies, as rules-based societies and states, with the fact that political interests are increasingly intertwined with growing economic dependencies. I would like to add interdependencies. In the context of more clearly diverging political interests, economic interests may be affected, and this is of course much more an object for action at times where global value chains are of such high importance for all our modern and ever more interconnected economies. So that is a pressing case, as Deputy Foreign Minister described it, indeed. And the decisions which were taken at the EU level do represent a clear signal to China that the European Union is united in responding to this challenge. No matter the state of bilateral relations between China and Lithuania, and each one of our member states has their own specific bilateral relationship with China, as they have also with other states around the globe. But trade restrictions applied by any third country are directly implicating the entire EU and are affecting the integrity of the EU single market, even if it would only affect Lithuania. But as was pointed out, there are significant secondary effects. So we have a number of member states, a number of companies from different countries which are directly affected. We have been since since November in close contact with the Lithuanian authorities, in fact, already before, with regard to the development of bilateral relations and the diplomatic impact all of this had. The door remains always open for diplomatic contacts which exist with both the Chinese side, but which are permanent with our Lithuanian member state. We want to make sure that a resolution is found, and we have underlined that will by the fielding of the WTO case with the first phase, which are the consultation requests. All member states supported the launch of this case. This is an expression of one of the key DNAs of the EU. We are a rules-based organization. We use the rules of the World Trade Organization. China is now for the 20th year member of that organization and has vastly benefited from it and has agreed to be bound by multilateral rules. And I would like to add, all dispute settlement findings of the WTO have also been followed up by China. The EU does engage with China on WTO reform at the same time, and we will make sure that the WTO rules will be used so that China complies to its international obligations. It is not the fact that measures were not announced in the law or in a regulation or in a customs directive is not the case, but we do also have many cases of companies which have very concrete negative impact. We have more than 100 containers which are not cleared. We have companies which cannot do not get import licenses into China, and therefore we are having a situation which is a de facto situation, which is clearly developing negatively and affecting the normal trade relations between us as Europeans and China. At the same time, we need to cooperate with China wherever we can. We need to compete with China wherever we need, and we need to show clear red lines wherever it is necessary. And sometimes it is in the same field, and the trade relations are a very good example for this. At the same time, we have had more trade with China than ever before in the last year. So the Chinese have got a clear message from Europe, and you have referred to the fact that in addition to this, we have the Commission has proposed to have an anti-economic coercion instrument. Some people say it was high time. Well, yes, it is part of a series of steps where we are increasing the autonomous possibilities for the European Union to defend itself. And if this is becoming now more of a pattern of autocratic states to take economic measures for political purposes, we must be able to respond to this by measures which are compatible with the international legal order, but which are in the field of trade and investment as well. And this is the main purpose of this new instrument, which we hope will be adopted in an accelerated procedure this year, promoted by the French and the Czech Council presidency, but also promoted by the important majorities which Mr. Bütikofer has referred to. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gunnar. Excellent overview. I would like to repeat my call to the audience here to ask questions or make short comments via Slido. You see a QR code on the right that you can use to access the GLOBSEC place on Slido, or you join via the app slido.com and you put in hashtag GLOBSEC. So I already have a few questions here, but we're certainly collecting more. And at this point, I would like to turn to Iana Dreyer, our legal and trade expert here. Iana, what is your take on this debate? I mean, is everything okay? Does Lithuania need more solidarity? does the EU really dispose of sharp instruments, or how do you assess the situation? And the floor is yours, Iana.
Thank you very much, Roland, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I would widely share the assessment made by everyone, and notably by Reinhard Bütikofer, that there probably hasn't been enough public, on the record support for Lithuania from the big member states individually, such as Germany or France, although France is doing, is leading some action as president of the EU itself, but the president of France, which has a direct line to Xi Jinping, we don't know exactly what has been going on there. This is indeed becoming an EU-wide issue. The response of the EU is interesting and as predicted, and I think the fact that the EU moved quickly and quicker than expected with filing a case at the WTO is a sign that this is being taken very seriously, and also a sign that China has not taken any diplomatic overtures so far very seriously. I was asked to talk more about the anti-coercion instrument that is coming, and it is a bit my day job to analyze the trade policy of the EU, so I will go into that. The anti-coercion instrument, as proposed, aims at giving the European Commission powers to respond to situations precisely like these ones. It wasn't designed for Lithuania. It was already in the making because we have increasing issues with economic coercion across the world, notably due to China leveraging it even more, but not only. What it wants to do is to empower the Commission to officially state this is a situation of coercion, whatever it is. It's very vague. What is economic coercion? It is left open, probably rightly. And what it also allows the Commission is to very quickly enact potentially very sweeping trade and investment and all sorts of economic restrictions on a country that was found to coerce and that has not, after diplomatic and other engagements, removed these coercive actions. Now, that's all fine. Well, foreign policy people think this is fine. When you look at it a bit more closely, technically, there are two issues with this. One, it is we are at a border where we're stretching the limits of what trade policy can do. Trade policy is a centralized policy in the EU, so there is qualified voting majority. Foreign policy is still the prerogative, the ultimate prerogative of member states, and any decision taken at EU level requires unanimity. And here we are at the, stretching the limits of what trade policy can do when foreign policy remains fragmented in the EU. And it is very startling to see how much power the Commission proposes to give itself in such a case. The procedure foreseen is what is called comitology. I will spare you all the details of this, but fundamentally you need a qualified majority member state to oppose it. The aim is clear, it's precisely to, get around this issue of having to take unanimous decisions in very difficult foreign policy situations. Europe, the EU knows a lot about these situations, but the matter is wider. I mean, we see right now a bit of a slide in the EU where the big member states tend to dominate the game and tend to also have, I find, a bit overbearing powers, influence on the Commission top leadership and on the Council presidency itself when it comes to precisely China. And so what I fear that this instrument can do is deter potentially some more mid-ranking powers from trying to attempt to coerce the EU or member states or things like that. But I'm very skeptical that this can work in a case such as the one which just came there as a textbook example of this one with Lithuania. What does the Lithuania case show? First, the damage done is always asymmetric. So the damage done to the EU is probably quite small in the grand scheme of things for the EU single market, for Chinese trade, etc. It obviously hits Lithuania disproportionately, so very strongly there, but the Anti-Coercion Instruments has a very laudable goal to use proportionality, a basic principle of rule of law, of international law. What do you do in a case like that? How do you price the damage done to Lithuania, to the single market, and the countermeasures you would take, proportionate, how do you define it? Would they deter China at all? I tend to be skeptical of that. Beyond the political question, if China would ever get itself deterred through such a measure, when it comes to a question such as Taiwan, which it increasingly is a very hard line on. And I wonder that if the Commission, there are rumors that the Commission wants to go big, that we get the phone call from the Elysee or the Bundeskanzleramt, and then this goes down. I mean, these are political realities in Europe, and I'm glad I'm the one independent here who can spell them out a little bit. This is what we're dealing with. So, I mean, we leave it out there. The Anti-Coercion Instrument, it's probably necessary to have it. I'm not advocating any change to it. I think it's a political instrument that is useful to have as a toolkit, but it will not resolve such situations in such a case, because as I said, I don't think it works for the very big member states. What I think is necessary now and is ripe actually for adoption is that the EU institutions and the Commission can do so much more on streamlining a bit more the EU's and the member states' China policy. There have been proposals around by think tanks, by business, by the most conservative of political groups, the EPP, to have a China task force in the Commission that aims to sort of rationalize everything that has to do with China, have direct communication with member states, to deal with crisis, to anticipate on crisis, to share views, to have a common language on issues such as what exactly do we mean by our one China policy? Everyone pursue it. It's an official EU policy, it's an official member state policy, but how do we deal with this? What exactly does this mean when we only open a representative office, which every member state has the right to do? But how do we deal with this? It is possible to do that even within the current treaties. And the leadership we have now in Brussels, in the Commission, has not responded yet to this. And I think it is high time we do that. On top of starting to discuss seriously now the question of going to qualified voting majority in some sections of foreign policy, the discussion was quite ripe, ripening up under the last Commission already. And I think we should really seriously revive it, because the various crises we're having right now, the one with China is one, Russia was mentioned, but there are others. I think it is time that we start this discussion, because ultimately it's in the interest, it's not a federalist dream, it's in the interest of every single member state that we get this together, because we also are easier, if China realizes Lithuania is the EU, it will probably not be able to act, or this increases the cost to act the way China does on this matter, because it directly means you're talking to Brussels and you're talking to Paris and to Rome, to everyone else. So that's my view. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Iana. Lots of food for thought I have from all the contributions here. We also have a couple of questions. Let me at this point remind our audience, you can ask questions and make short comments via Slido. You go to the slido.com app, or and then you use hashtag GLOBSEC, or you take the QR code. Colleagues, can we have the QR code again? Yeah, that's coming here. Okay, or you use this QR code to directly access the place where you can ask questions and make short comments. Right, I would like to take a couple of questions from the audience here. And there's one directly to Minister Adomėnas, actually from someone who has a Lithuanian sounding name, Mr. Evaldas, who is asking, anti-cohesion measures could be used not only against China, but against the US. And there was a situation a few years ago when such an instrument could have come in handy. So what is the Lithuanian position on including the US into the addressees of the anti-coercion instrument? Over to you, Minister.
Thank you. Well, we maintain that disputes over trade policy and measures applied unilaterally when it comes to democratic countries that recognize the rule of law can be resolved through existing legal mechanisms and channels. So in a sense, invocation of such instrument, anti-coercion instrument, would not be necessary. I think it's primarily when we venture into the territory where international agreements are disregarded and obligations undertaken when joining and international organizations are ignored, that such defensive instruments need to be applied and need to be invoked. And of course, responding to Iana Dreyer's remarks, anti-coercion instrument is not a panacea, clearly. I mean, it's I totally sort of agree with the limitations of that were pointed out. Maybe they could sort of be fine-tuned to be sort of, you know, less less visible, less blatant, or sort of less prominent than you pointed out at the moment, by working on a sort of better formula. But it's very clearly not a panacea. It has to be seen as part of a toolbox, and but without it, the toolbox lacks the central sort of instruments. But of course, political instruments of political solidarity and showing very concrete political support are necessary complements to sort of anti-coercion instrument. And there are, of course, difficulties involved that trade rules and trade areas have to be defended by appealing to a sort of political instrument. But this is what follows when the trade is politicized by China. Then sort of, you know, this necessitates political response in order to preserve that political framework and that legal framework within which common trade area can subsist and trade can be pursued in globally. So in essence, the invocation of this of the political responses is provoked by the very fact of politicizing trade. And yes, and I just wanted to thank Reinhard Bütikofer, who was and continues to be the spiritus movens of political solidarity with Lithuania in the European Parliament, as well as Gunnar. Thanks for you for working behind the scenes to move to the protection of our common trade area in your institution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you also for those words of thanks. Let me now come to a question by Jürgen Mantas from the Cologne Institute for International Economics. And he addresses this under the radar character of China's coercive measures. So what is frightening is that China breaks the WTO rules without dramatically and obviously doing so, and denies to be doing it. What future do you see for the World Trade Organization with such an approach? And I would like to give this to Gunnar Wiegand. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, we have to face situations which may be different from the past, where there were obvious there was obvious formal official evidence for trade lawyers to work on. The world is changing. The tactics are changing. You will see that when you talk to foreign policy, security policy, communication, representatives of China, they all have good reasons why Lithuania should be sanctioned for its policy. When you talk to trade officials, when you talk to customs officials, then there is no confirmation of any sanction of any step. Well, we had the situation that for weeks Lithuanian companies could not enter any request even for a license to export goods because there was no Lithuania in the customs code of China. So there are de facto situations as well as the non-clearance of containers in ports. The response has been, of course, a very pragmatic one by the companies. That means to redirect their goods. And other countries are picking this up, like Australia had to redirect a lot of its barley, which now Saudi Arabia is the main customer, or a lot of its coal, which has gone now a lot to Japan and Korea. So companies themselves will find answers, but official organizations representing the interests of our members, we need now to provide the evidence of the de facto situation. That is for lawyers like in cases which they know from other fields than from trade policy. But there are other fields of law where it is exactly that. You have to produce evidence. And that's what we are going to do.
Yeah, thanks very much. Reinhard Bütikofer, I will hand the floor to you in a second. I just wanted to emphasize that one of those pragmatic reactions and redirection of goods is that Taiwan is now awash with Lithuanian rum. I understand that 20,000 bottles have actually been bought by clients in Taiwan, which is a fantastic example of solidarity, I guess. Now, Reinhard Bütikofer, you wanted to come in here.
The question that Mr. Mantas asked reminded me of my time as a member of the wrestling team in an American high school long ago. We did Greek style wrestling. But if your opponent comes to the match on the basis of another approach, saying no holds barred, if you stick to the Greek style alone, you will pretty sure lose the match. So in a case like the one we have here, where Chinese geopolitics weaponizes economic interdependency, we cannot react adequately just sticking to economic measures. We're still, to some degree, following a book that says this is a world in which geoeconomics dominates, but that's no longer true. That used to be our belief. On the basis of that belief, we expected China to somehow at some point in time become a responsible stakeholder. They have changed the rules according to which they play. And of course, we need to use our economic instruments, because there we have better instruments than we would otherwise be able to wield. And we can use the anti-coercion instruments once we have it with a qualified majority, which obviously gives us some leeway that on exclusively foreign policy, in the foreign policy realm, could be blocked by a single veto. So clearly, because of the internal construction of our institutions, we were tending to look for economic solutions, but we have to also play hardball, and we also have to use instruments that may not be in the book. And just to insist on being reciprocal or at times, I think you have to be willing to retaliate, not in kind, but where it hurts. And I think we have not yet developed that ability fully. So, for instance, look at the upcoming EU-China Summit. Purportedly, it's scheduled for the beginning of April. Will we make Lithuania a topic there, a make or break topic? Or will we go through the normal routines, and in the end, we have no conclusions, and then the European side says, and by the way, at some point during the discussions, we mentioned Lithuania. How are we going to approach that?
Very good questions, and I would love to, for maybe Gunnar Wiegand to answer this. I have also a question from Noah Barkin from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, going also to you, Gunnar. Thierry Breton said that talks with China on Lithuania had been in vain, quote unquote. So has the EU had any positive de-escalation signals from Beijing since the row began? So please, so what are the signals from Beijing, but also how about the EU-China Summit in April, and how are you going to handle Lithuania there? Gunnar, over to you.
Well, first, I would like to say that we are celebrating the new lunar year. And that means there are no decisions taken right now in China. And the Olympic Games are about to start. So the mood is festive in China. The exact confirmation for the date of the EU-China Summit, which indeed both sides wish to hold soon, has not yet been fixed. So Reinhard Bütikofer has the right instinct, but I cannot confirm the summit will take place that or that date. And of course, he has the right instinct because for all the last many years, we have had at least one summit per year with China. And we had, unfortunately, none last year. We had, in fact, a significant reduction of communication at political level with China in the wake of the sanctions and disproportionate counter-sanctions which were imposed in March of last year. That is the situation we need to overcome because we want to manage responsibly our relations with China, as I said before, which happens to be the largest trading partner in goods of the European Union. And of course, a partner for many, many other sector policy areas, but also for global and regional challenges we need to work with. So that is a matter, therefore, of the responsible conduct of our relations. And that includes, by definition, that we also need to address all the areas of divergences. The Chinese side has signaled its readiness to solve the issue of this outstanding major difficulty between us in the run-up to, before the summit. Well, let's test the goodwill of China to do this. So we will certainly try to do this, but if it is not solved, then it has to be one of the key issues to be discussed for all the reasons which were evoked before, because it affects the entirety of the trade relationship between the EU and China, even though the actual volume affected directly may be limited. Let me say one, if Roland, you allow this other issue, address one other issue, because Iana Dreyer said it's about time that the EU gets a proper China policy in place. Well, we do have a proper China policy in place, which has been fixed in 2019, where a whole series of new autonomous steps was identified to increase our resilience, to improve level playing fields between the two sides, but also underlining how much we have to be able in sometimes the very same policy fields to cooperate, to compete, and also to show clear red lines. It is a very complex exercise to do this at 27, and unity is the key for any real impact which the EU wishes to have with China. But the policy was endorsed by the European Council in late 2020 formally, and we do have, it is not called China Task Force, but I can reassure you there is a strategy group which does exist with all the key Directors General of the Commission, with the Secretaries General of the Commission and of the European External Action Service, where we are strategizing about the best way on how to deal with China. So it is not just improvisation with day-to-day business. Of course, if there is one big country with one party only and a vertical power structure, that is in one country, it may be easier to strategize with regard to steps across the globe than it is in a union of 27 sovereign nations who are pooling their sovereignty in some policy areas. That is admitted. But that is a difficulty we have whether we deal with China or any other partner in the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gunnar. I have a short follow-up question myself here at this point. Actually, one of our listeners, Emre Peker, hints at the question of US aligning with the United States. And this is something I would like to pitch to Mantas and Reinhard. Would it make sense for the EU to actually close ranks more visibly and more importantly with the United States in terms of China policy, China strategy, but also sanctions against China in cases such as the one at hand? So over to you, Mantas, first.
Well, I suppose you couldn't have thought of a more difficult question, and it's more difficult to answer in a sort of limited time frame that we have. I think the principle of answering such question is what is the foundation of our sort of China, well, or vision of the world that we want, and what role do we want to have China to play in it, and what are sort of our possibilities to achieve it. And primarily, I think if we look at the foundations of the global world order we want to defend, it's sort of the rule of law, the respect for international norms, the respect for democracy, liberty, and human rights as the foundation and measure of human progress, then we have clearly a sort of a case for communal vision, for shared vision with the United States. The difficulty probably lies in the fact in the remark that you prefaced our discussion with, is that the EU has to learn the language of power. And at the beginning of the present commission, there was also sort of a phrase articulated that it has to become a geopolitical union. So far, we are sort of quite, well, not entirely there, if I may put it sort of with some Chinese understatement. Not entirely there, but we're moving in that direction. And of course, if you talk about language of power usually speaks in short sentences. It used to be the case that EU language, political language, had a lot of subordinate clauses, which reflected sort of the shades of meaning of all the 27 members. Now, I mean, so when I see the EU's reaction, when appealing to the WTO, the speed really astonishes me. And yes, we have a glimpse and glimmer of EU institutions realizing what it means to speak in a rapidly changing world with the language of power. But I think we still have a lot of lessons to learn, and only when we have the same sort toolbox, the same instrumentarium as our transatlantic friends and colleagues, then we can have really sort of shared projects and jointly implement this vision, which is for us is a crucial sort of, for countries like Lithuania, is a crucial interest. Why are we sort of talking about sort of needing support to Taiwan's people's aspirations to live in a democratic society? Because only in the world which does respect international norms, which does live by the international agreements that it signed, can countries like Lithuania hope to survive? If it's sort of and this is what we see happening in a few hundred kilometers away from us in Ukraine. If EU had been more resolute in putting forward its demands towards Russia, we wouldn't have encouraged the tyrant in Kremlin having this military buildup and being poised on a to invade a sovereign nation to which it gave guarantees in 1994. Guarantees of territorial integrity, Ukraine, and Budapest Accord. So in a sense, we are reaping what we've sown, but I hope that at least in this year, we will learn finally that, what it is to be a geopolitical unit and what it means and what grammar it takes to speak the language of power.
Okay,
if I may add
I still
to
haven't
that,
heard. Yes, please, Reinhard, go ahead.
I would say, on one hand, we're already cooperating more strongly with the US than we have in the past. Think of the transatlantic dialogue on China. Think of the Trade and Tech Council that where 7 out of 10 working groups deal directly or indirectly with China. But I would not agree to the assumption that the US are always ahead of us in how to deal with China. Looking at, for instance, the climate issues, they're certainly not ahead of us. And certainly we also need to work with other partners. We cannot restrict our outreach just to the US. We have to work with India, with Japan, Australia, Korea, ASEAN, African nations. If we just have a transatlantic partnership that tries to defend the status quo, that's not a promising trajectory. We have to offer a better option of cooperation with third countries, and the US are not always the leader there. So for instance, when I compare the Global Gateway Initiative that the European Union is taking, we're clearly ahead of what President Biden has with regard to the Build Back Better world. That's just a page and a half of talking points. We have a strategy. So I'm very much in favor of working with the US, and the German government has pledged explicitly in the coalition agreement to work more intensely with the US on China, but it's not a one-size-fits-all and one solution just to work with the US.
Gunnar, before you get the floor, just Emre Peker insists on discussing other fields of EU action vis-a-vis China, such as sanctions over Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, generally, and Taiwan and the South China Sea. Is there any change on the horizon with a tougher EU stance on this? Would you please, Gunnar, combine this with your planned answer? Thank you. Floor is yours.
First, I cannot agree more with the head of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with China. It is not a question about the EU aligning with the US. You could also ask the question differently. Should the US not align with the EU? Somehow people don't come to that question. Just remember, there was a very different US administration recently, and we had some significant differences over how to deal with China. And inter alia, we were not in agreement with the unilateral trade measures taken by the US, which we consider as not being in conformity with WTO rules. There is a key DNA difference between the way that administration acted and we are acting. Bütikofer, of course, pointed at the obvious difference also over climate change. Or the United States left the Human Rights Council, left the WHO. If you do not use multilateral rules, how do you want to keep others through the rules-based international order? So therefore, we are glad that this administration has a different approach, which has allowed us also to fill with a lot of very concrete substance our cooperation under the EUS dialogue on China, under the EEAS dialogue on the Indo-Pacific, and certainly in the Trade and Technology Council. It does not mean that we always have the same positions, but it means we talk about these positions and we cooperate when it is in the interest of both of us, and often it is. And you will see that we also have the EUS Energy Council in the next few days in Washington at political level. The initiative for that closer cooperation came, by the way, from the European Union, not from the United States. It was the proposal of High Representative Borrell to Secretary Pompeo, and then we started to properly work on this afterwards. But we talk here about increased ways of cooperation based on higher levels of convergence, but the European Union must be able to formulate its own interests, to be able to formulate its own autonomous interests and to use its own areas where it is most powerful as a geo-economic actor with a geopolitical conscience and awareness. We are, in terms of Taiwan, I only want to say we, of course, very closely follow everything that is happening between Beijing and Taiwan over the Taiwan Strait, and we are concerned, and we have to think about all the possible developments, and should not be surprised, but should be ready. And that may not have been sufficiently the case with regard to Hong Kong, where we have been, I think, collectively across the globe surprised by the speed with which the one country, two systems were dismantled. And the main answer to the steps which are taken where China becomes ever more assertive is that we must more consciously take steps which are in the EU's realm, using our economic, using our legal normative powers. And so the anti-coercion instrument is just one of those examples. There's a foreign subsidies instrument which has been proposed and should be soon adopted. There's an international procurement instrument which has been far too long between Council and Parliament, but should be adopted in a short period this year. We are now applying an investment screening system, and we are also we are also applying the 5G toolbox. It's not always a question of sanctions. Sanctions should not be the primary instrument of international relations, and also not of international economic relations.
Yes, thanks very much. We have 5 minutes left, dear colleagues, so I would ask you to be extremely brief now. And Iana, can I combine this with another question from the floor about the future of the WTO, again from Jürgen Mantas from Cologne. Would it be possibly necessary one day to actually create an alternative trade organization without China? Over to you, very briefly.
Thank you very much. On the WTO, let me step back a little bit. I think the EU must now come to the realization of some member states that the EU will increasingly feel alone. I think it has been mentioned that we had an administration in the United States that contributed to significantly to disrupting many things in the rules-based international order broadly, but in particular at the WTO. And the new administration we have now is not coming back. The appellate body, so sort of, we had judicial dispute settlement, which still exists, but the appellate body is now dead. And it's not coming back in any foreseeable future. So the WTO system is weaker and weaker. And that's why increasingly countries feel free to do whatever, including coercion. So you can go to the WTO, to say, okay, you're violating the trade facilitation agreement here. But that's not the point. The problem is bigger. And it's also a problem that the WTO cannot solve because the matters are geopolitical, and it's like a bit with the EU and foreign policy and its trade policy. You're asking the WTO to resolve matters that it is not designed to resolve. But at the same time, it is really weakening, and it's not going to get back. So I think what the EU should do in any premise is to be prepared to act alone. I don't say unilaterally, but I think everything that has been said about forging new alliances, working with other countries that have similar problems, build those ties. I think that is an absolute priority. And as I said again, there is a big temptation in the EU to delegate a lot to trade policy. There is only so much it can do. And to respond to Gunnar, who explained very well everything that is there in terms of China policy, from the 5G toolbox to the task force, it is just not enough. I mean, you cannot have a situation where at the end of last year, you develop a Taiwan policy and then suddenly it disappears because there's a bit of ruffling feathers. I think you need to stand your ground a little bit more. And you can do that within the treaties.
Thanks very much, Iana. Before I summarize, just one sentence still from Mantas, the Lithuanian Deputy Foreign Minister. Mantas, how is this going? Which direction are we going here in view of the threats that are facing us?
Well, if we want to overcome this threat, then we have to be sort of equally long-term and strategically thinking as China, which applied these sanctions is. And so I just want to emphasize by sort of that it's not a case of China versus Lithuania, but it's you talked about Europeanizing this case. But yes, it is the case of threat against the EU common market. It's also the case that it's a threat for the future against any country that in any way transgresses whatever sort of imaginary red lines of the Chinese Communist Party might propose. If they prove the concept with Lithuania, they will have this instrument for the years to come to apply against any sort of country they choose. So this is when we're discussing this, we should realize that the stakes of what lies on the resolving these cases. And it's also sort of whether we are moving further into this sort of world without rules and international agreements, as was sort of Hong Kong case has proved, or sort of can we stop that downslide? Well, this is I think what is at stake here, and that's why it is it's not just about Lithuania. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let me wrap up and just give you a couple of selective takeaways here. The world has become a more dangerous place. While we are more interdependent, the global institutions that underpin our prosperity and free trade and our freedom are actually getting weaker. That's a fact. So the EU does have to learn the language of power and develop a toolbox to deal with coercion from the outside, which in this case that we have discussed here was against Lithuania, but in fact is a threat to the single market itself, putting into question the cohesion of the European Union as such. And that toolbox has several components. The anti-coercion instrument is only one of them. We have named other examples such as investment screening or 5G toolbox. But in any case, the deterrence and the possible pushback effect that is caused by these instruments has to be complemented also by active solidarity. And that means making up for damages that are incurred because of external coercion against individual member states. And here I'm sure we haven't reached the end of our possibilities vis-a-vis Lithuania in this current confrontation. Practicing solidarity. And finally, 2 points. One, the EU needs to be more courageous in bringing up controversial topics in EU-China summits. While it is necessary to talk, we will have to be a little bit more active in saying what we consider a threat to what we stand for, to our very fundamental principles. And finally, the transatlantic angle, while we may not agree on every point with the United States, this axis remains a crucial one in confronting a more threatening, authoritarian, actually global axis, global alliance, which is increasingly spearheaded by the Chinese Communist Party. So with that, I would say, to sum everything up here, the glass is half full, but there is a lot of room for improvement. Gunnar, one word from you, go ahead.
I don't want to have the last word, which you would just pronounce, but when you say developing a toolbox and having active solidarity, I just would like to underline active solidarity requires active solidarity in all directions. And that means also that we need to identify early on any trigger points which may require such solidarity. We cannot surprise each other, neither one member state the other, nor the member states, the EU institutions, and we all have to work, therefore, together early on, informally, to make it actually work. Full support for your conclusions otherwise.
Let me emphasize that the values that we stand for have to be well represented, not only by the member states, but also by the EU institutions. If that happens, everything is okay. I think then we're all happy, and the glass will actually be 2/3 full. But there is room for improvement. Gunnar and everybody else, thank you so much. It was a lively debate. It was a debate with many different voices, and we're certainly going to continue the discussion at other venues. Thank you very much for participating. Thanks to the audience. Sorry I couldn't take all the questions, but there will be another time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.